The day Eliza Fletcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas. The summer of 1879 was burning so hot that even the dust seemed reluctant to rise from the cracked earth beneath her wagon wheels. And the first thing she noticed was not the saloon, not the general store, not the sheriff's office with its peeling paint. It was the south field of the Garrett farm on the edge of town, sitting empty and silent under a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted there by someone with too much hope and not enough sense. She had come a long way. 3 weeks on a rattling wagon from Abilene, where she had buried her father in a churchyard that smelled of cedar and loss. And before that a month of letters back and forth with her cousin Martha Holden, who had written in her careful looping script that Caldwell was a fine town, a decent town, a town where a woman who knew how to work the land and keep her head could make something of herself. Martha had not mentioned that Caldwell sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail, where the cattle drives thundered through each season, and turned the main street into a river of noise and mud and men, who smelled like they had not seen a bathtub since before their mothers had given up praying for them. Martha had also not mentioned that the land around Caldwell was beautiful in a way that could make a woman feel both very small and very grateful at the same time. Those flat sweeping plains rolling out to the horizon under that impossible sky. And that in the middle of all of it, on a slight rise at the southern edge of town, sat a farmhouse with a wide porch and a field on its south side that had been left to go wild with thistle and dry grass, and whatever the wind had thought to scatter across it. Eliza pulled her wagon to a stop in front of the general store, which bore a painted sign that read Hollies and Sons, though the only Hollies she would ever see was a stout woman of 50, with a bun the color of iron, and the handshake of a man who drove cattle for a living. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, because she had learned somewhere around the second day out of Abilene that waiting for help was the same as waiting for rain in July possible, but not something to build a plan around. Inside the store it was cooler, smelling of tobacco and dried beans and leather, and there were 2 men at the counter and a woman browsing bolts of calico. The woman at the counter was Mrs. Hollies herself, and she looked at Eliza the way a person looks at something they are not sure they have ordered but are prepared to receive anyway. "You would be Martha Holden's cousin," Mrs. Hollies said. It was not a question. "Eliza Fletcher," Eliza said and put out her hand. Mrs. Hollies shook it. "Martha said you were capable. I try to be. You looking for work or land?" Eliza had a small amount of money from her father's estate, not enough to buy much but enough to begin something, and she had come with the intention of hiring on with someone who needed a hand with their household or their books until she could save enough to lease a parcel of her own. She said something to this effect, and Mrs. Hollies nodded slowly, the way a woman does when she has already been thinking 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "There is a man named Harvey Garrett who has a farm on the South Road," Mrs. Hollies said. "He has been managing on his own for going on 2 years now, and he is not managing particularly well. His house wants someone to keep it, and I imagine his books do too, though he would not tell you that himself. He is a proud man, not unkind, just proud." One of the men at the counter, a younger fellow with a red kerchief around his neck and boots that had seen better decades, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Harvey Garrett does not want help," he said. "He has made that plain enough." "He wants help," Mrs. Hollies said calmly. "He does not want to ask for it." "Those are 2 different things, and I think Miss Fletcher looks like a woman who understands the difference." Eliza looked out the dusty window at the street, then back at Mrs. Hollies. "I could ride out and introduce myself," she said. "That would not be asking him anything. That would be giving him an opportunity." Mrs. Hollies smiled for the first time, a quick hard smile like sunlight off a plow blade. "South Road," she said. "The farm with the empty field on the south side. You cannot miss it." She could not miss it, and that was the truth. The farmhouse was the kind of place that had been built with intention, sturdy and square, with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front, and a barn set back at a sensible angle to catch the morning light on its doors. There was a kitchen garden that someone had been keeping up, at least in part, and there were chickens moving in their loose, random way around the yard, and there was a good well with a rope and bucket that hung plumb and straight. But the south field, a long rectangular plot of rich dark soil that should have been throwing up corn or sorghum, or at the very least some kind of forage crop, was nothing but a tangle of dry grass and wild thistle, and you could see from 20 yards away that no plow had touched it in a long time. Harvey Garrett was on the porch when Eliza rode up in her wagon. He was sitting in one of two chairs that stood side by side against the wall of the house, and he was not doing anything in particular, just sitting there with his hands resting on his knees, and his hat pushed back on his head, and his eyes somewhere out on the horizon that only he could see. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two on either side of it, with a lean, weathered face and dark hair that had been cut recently, but not by anyone who considered themselves a barber, and his hands, when she got close enough to see them, were the hands of a man who had worked hard for a long time and had the intentions of going on doing so. He did not stand up when she came into the yard. He looked at her, and that was something, a straight level look that was not rude but was also not performing any kind of welcome. "Mr. Garrett," she said from the wagon seat. "That is me," he said. "My name is Eliza Fletcher. I am newly arrived in Caldwell, and I am looking for a position as a housekeeper or bookkeeper, possibly both. Mrs. Holly's at the general store suggested I might speak with you." There was a silence in which a rooster somewhere around the back of the barn voiced an opinion that nobody had asked for. Harvey Garrett looked at her for a long moment, then looked away toward the south field with an expression she could not yet read. "I do not need help," he said. "All right," Eliza said, and did not move. He looked back at her. "I just said I do not need help." "You did," she agreed, "and I heard you. I am only sitting here collecting myself before I drive back to town, if you do not mind." He did not say that he minded, which she took as permission. She climbed down from the wagon, which surprised him. She could see it in the way he shifted slightly in his chair, and she tied her horse to the porch rail and stood there for a moment looking at the south field the way you look at something that is asking you a question. "You have not planted that field," she said. It was not an accusation. It was just what was true. He said nothing for a moment. Then quietly he pointed. He pointed at the second chair on the porch, the one beside him, the one that was empty. He pointed at it with one extended finger, and then he put his hand back on his knee and looked away. It took Eliza a moment to understand what he meant, and then it landed in her chest like something dropped from a height, not painful exactly, but solid. There had been someone who sat in that chair, someone who was no longer here to sit in it. And the field, the south field that should have been green and alive, had gone unplanted because the person who had sat in that chair was gone, and whatever had made him want to plant it had gone with them. She did not say she was sorry. She had learned that people who were grieving heard "I am sorry" approximately 10,000 times, and that after a while the word stopped meaning anything at all, like a coin that had been handled so much the face had worn smooth. Instead, she stood there a moment more looking at the empty chair, and then she looked at Harvey Garrett. "Is there a position available or not?" she asked. "Because if there is, I am good with figures, and I know how to keep a house, and I can cook things that a person would want to eat, which I understand is not a given in this part of Kansas." Something moved across his face. It was not a smile, it was something more complicated than that, something that had the shape of a smile somewhere inside it but had not quite found its way to the surface. "I cannot pay much," he said. "Tell me what you can pay," she said, "and I will tell you whether it is enough." He told her. It was not much. She told him it was enough because she needed a place to begin, and this looked like a place. She moved into the small spare room off the kitchen that same afternoon, carrying her trunk and herself before he could offer to help. And he did offer, pushing up from the chair with a kind of deliberate effort, the way a man moves when he has been sitting in one place for a long time, and the sitting has done something to his joints that is not entirely physical. She told him she had it, And she did have it. And she put it in the corner of the room and opened the window that looked out over the kitchen garden and took a breath of air that smelled like Kansas in summer, dry and warm and full of possibility if you were inclined to look for it. The first week she was there, she said very little that was not functional. She swept the kitchen and scrubbed the table and found that his ledger book, which he kept in a drawer in the sitting room, was 3 months out of date and had several columns that did not agree with each other. She updated the ledger without mentioning that she had found it in disorder, only presenting him with the corrected version one evening and pointing out 2 places where he had been overcharged by the man who supplied his grain. He looked at the ledger for a long time and then looked at her. "You found that," he said. "It is there in the numbers," she said. "You should speak with Dawes at the feed store." He did speak with Dawes the following morning, and he came back with a credit that was not enormous but was not nothing either, and he told her what had happened in a tone that was slightly less closed than any tone he had used before, and she nodded and said that was good, and he agreed that it was good, and they ate their supper in the kitchen in silence that was only a little bit like loneliness. She learned things about him in the way you learn things about a person when you share space with them, not from what they tell you, but from what you observe. He rose before dawn every day, and the first thing he did was stand on the porch in the dark for several minutes before he started his morning work, and she thought at first that he was watching for something, weather, perhaps, or animals. But after a few days, she understood that he was just standing there in the dark because it was the time of day when whatever he was carrying felt most bearable, before the light came and made everything real again. He was methodical about his work in a way that spoke of a man who had learned that if you did not keep moving, you would stop, and if you stopped, you might not start again. He kept the barn immaculate. He kept his tools hung in their proper places with a care that bordered on reverence. He had a horse named Captain who was enormous and black, and who clearly adored Harvey with an uncomplicated devotion that Eliza found quietly touching. He did not talk about his grief. She did not ask him to. In the second week, she planted the kitchen garden's neglected corner, which had gone to bind weed and was not doing the tomatoes any favors. She did it on a Tuesday morning while he was out checking the fence line on the north pasture, and when he came back and saw what she had done, he stopped in the yard and looked at it for a long moment. She watched him from the kitchen window and saw his jaw work in the way a jaw works when a person is deciding something. Then he walked to the barn without saying anything. That evening, he asked her if she had any experience with horses beyond driving a wagon. She said she had grown up on a working farm in Illinois before her family had moved to Abilene, and that she had been comfortable around horses since she was old enough to be put on one. He said that Captain needed exercising on the days when he could not take him out himself if she was willing. She said she was willing. That was how the first conversation that was not purely functional happened between them, and it was about a horse, which seemed right somehow for the kind of people they both were. Martha Holden came to visit on a Friday at the end of Eliza's second week, riding up in a buckboard with her husband Tom, who was a large, quiet man who raised hogs and had opinions about weather but not much else. Martha was a small, brisk woman with copper-colored hair and bright eyes, and the manner of someone who was keeping a great many thoughts organized in a very small space. And she hugged Eliza on the porch and looked around at the farmhouse with the slightly proprietary air of a person who has made a recommendation and is checking to see whether it has paid off. Harvey Garrett came out of the barn to greet them with the courtesy that was apparently simply built into him, shaking Tom's hand and nodding to Martha, and Martha looked at him with an expression that was readable if you knew what you were looking for. "You look better than the last time I saw you, Harvey," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, without softening it or sharpening it. He said he had been sleeping more, which was all he said, but he said it without defensiveness, and Martha nodded as though this confirmed something, and Eliza noticed, though she would not have been able to say exactly what she was noticing, that Harvey glanced at her briefly before he looked away. Later, when they were inside and Harvey had gone back to the barn, Martha sat at the kitchen table with a cup of Eliza's coffee and looked at her cousin with those bright, assessing eyes. "His wife died," Martha said. 2 years passed. She was called Clara. They had only been married 3 years when it happened. It was a fever, one of those fevers that comes on fast and does not give a person time to fight it. She was 26. Eliza sat across from her cousin and said nothing for a moment. Outside, she could hear Harvey moving around in the barn, the sound of wood and weight and purposeful effort. "He has not been the same since," Martha continued. "Not that anyone would be. He just stopped in certain ways. The farm is still running because Harvey Garrett is too stubborn to let anything stop entirely, but it is running at half. You can see it. That south field has not been touched since she died. Clara used to help him plant it." Eliza looked at the window over the sink, through which she could see the corner of the south field, just visible past the edge of the porch. "I'm not here to fix him," she said. "No," Martha agreed. "But it is worth knowing." She thought about what Martha had told her that evening while she was washing up after supper, and she thought about the 2 chairs on the porch side by side, and she thought about Clara, who had been 26 and had helped plant that south field and had sat in that chair and then was gone. She thought about her own father, who had been ill for 3 long months at the end, and who she had sat with every night in a kitchen that smelled of medicine and old coffee. And she thought that grief was the loneliest country a person could live in, not because there was no one around you, but because no one around you could quite reach where you were. She dried her hands and went to the sitting room doorway. Harvey was at the table with a newspaper from 2 weeks ago, reading it the way a man reads when he is not really reading. "Mr. Garrett," she said. He looked up. "I am sorry about your wife," she said. "I know that has been said to you many times already and that it does not do much good, but I mean it." He looked at her for a moment that was long enough to have been uncomfortable and was not. Then he said, "Her name was Clara." "I know," Eliza said. "Mrs. Hollis mentioned it." He nodded once. Then he went back to his newspaper. But something in the room had shifted in the way that air shifts just before rain, not visible, not dramatic, but present and real. August came in with a heat that lay over the Kansas plains like a blanket that no one had asked for. And in that heat, Eliza and Harvey Garrett fell into the rhythms of people who share space and work, and the hours of a day in a way that is neither entirely simple nor entirely complicated but feels, over time, like something that was always going to happen. He started eating breakfast at the kitchen table instead of taking it out to the porch alone, which he had done the first 2 weeks, and she made biscuits on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, because she had noticed he ate them with more enthusiasm than he ate anything else, and she did not make a point of noticing this, but she kept making them. He started talking at breakfast. Not extensively. Harvey Garrett was not an extensive talker in the way that some men were, the kind who filled up silence the way water fills a jar, because they were afraid of what the silence might contain. He talked the way a man talks when he has thought about something carefully and decided it was worth saying, and what he said was usually either practical or quietly funny in a way that did not announce itself as funny, and so was funnier for it. One morning in the middle of August he said, without preamble, "My neighbor Mr. Calhoun has a theory that the railroad is going to come through Caldwell before the year is out, and that land prices are going to do something dramatic. He told me this while I was fixing my north fence, and he was watching me fix it, which is something I have noticed Calhoun tends to do." Eliza, who was at the stove, said, "Does he have a basis for that theory, or is it more of an aspiration?" "With Calhoun," Harvey said, "it is genuinely difficult to tell." She laughed, and he looked pleased in the quiet, contained way he looked pleased when something worked out the way it was supposed to. The railroad talk was not entirely without basis, as it turned out. There were men from Topeka who came through Caldwell in September with surveying equipment and important-looking hats, and the town spent several days in a state of heightened speculation that expressed itself primarily through very long conversations at Mrs. Holly's store and an increased consumption of whiskey at the saloon, which was called the Prairie King, and was run by a man named Bertram Foss, who was generally considered the most well-informed person in Caldwell on any subject he chose to be well-informed about. Harvey rode into town to hear what Bertram Foss had to say, and he took Eliza with him because she had asked to go, and he had not found a reason to say no. And sitting beside her in the wagon on the way to town, he was aware of things he had not been aware of in a long time: the particular quality of the light on the plains in the late September afternoon, the way the air smelled of dry grass and distance, the fact that the person sitting next to him was alive and present in the way that some people are present, as though they take up the exact amount of space they were intended to take up and no more and no less. He thought about Clara, which he did every day, but he thought about her differently now than he had been thinking about her, not with the sharp weight of fresh grief, but with the softer ache of something that had moved from the center of him to a place that was still significant but was no longer consuming everything. He did not know exactly when that had happened. He thought it might have happened gradually, the way light changes in the fall, not all at once but in degrees, until one day you look up and realize the angle has shifted, and you are in a different season than the one you were in before. At the Prairie King, Bertram Foss was holding forth from behind his bar about the railroad surveyors with the authority of a man who had personally invited them, and the assembled citizens of Caldwell were listening with varying degrees of credulity. The conclusion that Bertram Foss offered after considerable preamble was that the railroad was likely to come, that it would likely follow the trail corridor, and that the south side of town was the likely landing point for a depot, which, if it was true, was a fact of considerable interest to Harvey Garrett, whose farm sat on the south side of town. On the wagon ride home, Harvey was quiet in a thinking way rather than a grieving way, and Eliza could tell the difference by now. "Your land would be valuable if the depot comes," she said. "It would," he agreed. "Would you sell?" He thought about that for a moment. "No," he said. "This is my land. Clara and I chose it together." He paused. "Besides, if there is a depot, the town will grow. That means more people needing grain, more people needing the things that a working farm can provide. It seems to me that is a reason to plant more, not to sell." She looked at him. The evening light was doing something lovely to the plains around them, turning everything amber and gold, and in that light Harvey Garrett looked like a man who had made a decision, not about the railroad but about something else. She was not sure he knew it yet. "You could plant the south field," she said. It was not a suggestion exactly. It was a thing she said into the air between them carefully, without pressure or direction, like putting a seed in the ground and then standing back. He did not answer right away. They drove in silence for several minutes, the wagon wheels turning on the packed dirt road, and then he said, "It would need to be turned first. The soil has gone hard." "I know," she said, "but it is good soil underneath." He said nothing more, and she did not press him, and when they got back to the farm he helped her down from the wagon without thinking about it, his hand at her elbow, and she stepped down and their hands separated, and they walked into the house without either of them remarking on the fact that it was the first time he had helped her down from the wagon, had reached for her, had touched her, had done anything that was not purely incidental. In October the nights turned cold in the way Kansas nights turn cold, quickly and completely, as though the temperature has been keeping a list and is now making its point all at once. Harvey built up the fireplace in the evenings, and after supper he would sometimes sit in the sitting room with his newspaper or his account books, and sometimes Eliza would sit in the chair across from him with her mending or her reading, and the fire would make the room warm and close, and the wind would come down from the north and push at the windows, and the two of them would sit there in a companionship that was not speaking of itself, but was also not pretending to be something other than what it was. One October evening she was mending a shirt of his that had given way at the shoulder seam, and he was going over the figures for the fall's livestock sales, and he said without looking up, My father always said the worst thing a man can do is stop working the land that was given to him to work. She kept mending. Did you believe him? I do, he said. I always have. He was quiet for a moment. I think I stopped believing it for a while, after Clara died. I think I stopped believing most things for a while. She looked up from the shirt. He was still looking at his ledger, his pen held loosely in his hand, and his expression was the expression of a man who is saying something he has been carrying for a long time, and is surprised to find that saying it does not make it heavier. "What brought you back?" she asked. He looked up then, and he looked directly at her, and it was one of those moments that exists in a different kind of time than ordinary moments, slower and clearer, as though something underneath the world has paused to pay attention. "Company," he said simply, and then he looked back at his ledger. She looked back at her mending. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. The fire crackled. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the evening, but when she went to bed she lay awake for a long time with the word company in her mind, turning it over, looking at its shape in the dark. The man who disrupted things, and there is always a man who disrupts things, in every small town, in every story about the kind of quiet happiness that is trying to become something more, was named Cole Darden, and he arrived in Caldwell in the 3rd week of October with a string of horses he claimed were his, and the look of a man who had left several places in a hurry. He was not violent in any obvious way, but he had the particular ease of a person who has learned that a certain kind of confidence, held steady, will get him what he wants from people who do not look too closely. Cole Darden took a liking to Eliza Fletcher. He made this clear in the particular way of men who have decided what they want and feel that the announcement of this decision is half the work done. He began appearing at the Garrett farm at inconvenient times with transparent pretexts, asking about a horse, asking about the road to the neighboring county, asking whether Harvey might be interested in a business arrangement he was vague about. And in the course of these appearances, he would talk to Eliza in a way that was pleasant on the surface, but had something underneath it that she recognized and did not like. Harvey recognized it too. She could see it in the way his jaw set when Cole Darden's horse appeared at the gate, and in the way he positioned himself, not aggressively but deliberately, between Darden and Eliza whenever they were all three in the same space. He did not make a scene. He was too contained for scenes, but he was present in a way that communicated itself clearly. One afternoon in late October, Darden came when Harvey was out checking the north pasture fence, and he found Eliza at the well, and he stood too close, and said something about how a woman like her was wasted keeping house for a man who could not be bothered to plant his own fields. And Eliza looked at him steadily, and said that she would appreciate it if he kept his opinions about her arrangements to himself. And Darden smiled the smile of a man who believes that resistance is just the beginning of a negotiation. Harvey came back from the north pasture 20 minutes later and found Darden still in the yard, and found Eliza at the porch with an expression that was controlled but not comfortable. And Harvey said to Darden, quietly and without raising his voice, "I think you have finished your visit." Darden looked at him for a moment with the measuring look of a man deciding whether something is worth the trouble. Then he mounted his horse and left, and Harvey stood watching until the horse was out of sight, and then he looked at Eliza. "He bother you?" he asked. "I handled it," she said. "I know you handled it," he said. "I am asking if he bothered you." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "He bothered me." "He will not come back," Harvey said, with a quiet certainty that she believed absolutely. And she did not know exactly what he was going to do about it, but she knew he was going to do something, and she also knew that she did not feel bothered anymore. He rode into town the next morning and had a conversation with Sheriff Abernathy, who was a steady man with a gray mustache, and the economy of motion of someone who has been in his profession long enough to know that most things require less fuss than people think. Whatever Harvey said, Darden left Caldwell within 2 days. Mrs. Hollis mentioned it to Eliza without elaborating, in a tone that suggested she approved. After Darden left, something changed between Harvey and Eliza, or perhaps it did not change so much as become more clearly itself, the way a photograph comes into focus. The shapes were always there, but now you could see them properly. He started talking to her the way a person talks to someone they trust completely, which is different from talking to someone you simply know. He told her about Clara, not once and dramatically, but gradually in pieces, the way a person can only really talk about the things that have changed them most profoundly. He told her that Clara had been from Ohio, that she had come out to Kansas with her family when she was 19, and had been unafraid of the plains in a way that had impressed him from the beginning. He told her that Clara had been the one who had seen the farmhouse on the rise above the South Road, and said that was the place, and she had been right. He told her that they had planted the south field together on the first spring after they married, and that Clara had made it a kind of ceremony. She had brought seeds from Ohio in a cloth bag that had been her grandmother's, and she had walked the rows and planted by hand while Harvey turned the soil, and they had talked all morning about what they would build and who they would be. Eliza listened to all of this, and she understood as she listened that he was not talking about Clara to keep her at a distance. He was talking about Clara because he trusted her enough to let her into the part of him where Clara lived, and that was a different thing entirely. She told him about her father, about the farm in Illinois, about the years in Abilene, about the 3 months of illness at the end when she had sat with him every night and known that he was going, and had tried to put everything they had said to each other into the space of those last weeks, not always succeeding, sometimes just sitting there in silence that was full of everything unsaid. She told him that she had come to Caldwell because she needed to start something rather than end something, because she had spent a long time ending things and was ready now for the other kind. He said that he understood that, and the way he said it made her believe that he did. November came, and with November came the first real cold, and with the cold came a certain compression of the day that draws people inward, closer to fire and warmth and each other. Harvey Garrett began leaving small things at her door that were not spoken about: a better lamp, a thicker blanket from the cedar chest in his room, a book he thought she might like that had belonged to Clara, and that he had held for a moment before he knocked on her door, and that she had taken with a care that told him she understood what it meant. She read the book. It was a collection of essays by someone who had traveled the Western Territories and written about what they found with a precision and wonder that she loved. And she told him at breakfast one morning that she had read it twice already, and he looked at her across the table with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she felt her breath catch in a way that she recognized and had not felt in a long time. They were not young people who had never had their hearts in their mouths before. Eliza was 28 and had navigated the world on her own long enough to know her own mind, and Harvey was 31 and had loved and grieved and worked and endured in ways that had made him someone of substance. What was happening between them was not the simple, breathless fall of young hearts meeting for the first time. It was something more considered than that, more deliberate, carrying more weight, and therefore, when it finally arrived at itself, more durable. The moment that cracked it open between them, finally and completely, was on the first day of December, a Saturday, when snow had been threatening all morning, and the sky was the color of pewter and the world had the closed-in feeling of a place waiting to become something. Harvey had been in the barn most of the morning with Captain, who had thrown a shoe on the frozen ground the day before and was not happy about it. And Eliza had made soup that had been simmering since breakfast and had gone out twice to check on the sky and concluded both times that the snow was coming and that Harvey should know it. The second time she went out, she went to the barn door and said that the snow was imminent and he should not linger, and he said he was almost done. And she stood in the barn doorway for a moment because it was warmer in the barn than outside, and Captain was looking at her with the large liquid eyes of an animal who has decided she is acceptable. And Harvey was bent over Captain's foreleg, with a focus and gentleness that she had come to think of as characteristic. The way he applied himself to anything that needed care, steady and quiet and thorough. When he finished, he straightened up and stroked Captain's neck once and looked at Eliza in the doorway, and she was lit from behind by the flat pewter light of the coming storm, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him, as though someone had cleared the fog from a window, that she was the most purely present person he had ever known, the most genuinely here, and that the farm felt like a place again, felt like somewhere that a life was happening because she was in it. He said, "Eliza." She looked at him. Something in the way he said her name was different from the way he had said it before. Her name in his mouth, with that particular quality, not asking anything, not performing anything, just saying it, made her stand very still, the way a person stands still when they want to remember exactly how a moment sounds. "I think," he said and stopped. He tried again. "I want to tell you something." "All right," she said. "I have not." He put one hand on the stall gate, not leaning on it but resting there, grounding himself. "I did not think that there would be. I thought that after Clara that was the sum of it, whatever I was going to have, and I made a kind of peace with that." He looked at her steadily. "But I find that I was wrong about that, and I think you should know that you are the reason I was wrong." The snow started then, the first few flakes drifting into the barn doorway around her, settling on the shoulders of her coat, and Eliza Fletcher looked at Harvey Garrett across the warm, dim space of the barn and felt the full weight and rightness of the moment settle around her like the snow, quietly and completely. "Harvey," she said, "I came to Caldwell to start something." She paused. "I think this might be it." He came to her. He crossed the barn with the deliberate, unhurried movement that was simply the way he moved through the world, and when he reached her, he raised one hand and touched her face, just her jaw, just his fingers curved against her jaw, and she leaned into it, the slight fraction that said everything. He kissed her. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of kiss that knows what it is, that has waited for itself to be ready, and it was warm and certain in the cold December barn while the snow came down outside and Captain made a sound of mild interest from his stall. And when it ended, they stood there close together for a moment, his hand still against her face, her breath visible in the cold air between them. "The soup is going to be ready," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere that has not been used in a while and is glad to be back in service. She loved the sound of it in the way you love a thing you did not know you had been waiting for. They went inside. The snow came down in earnest outside, covering the fields and the porch and the empty chairs, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate the soup, and talked in the easy particular way of two people who have just said something important, and are now moving forward together into whatever comes next. What came next, in the weeks that followed, was the kind of happiness that is not made of grand gestures, but of the accumulation of ordinary moments that have been given permission to be more than ordinary. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, even in the cold, wrapped in separate coats, talking or not talking, watching the winter sky that went from blue to pink to deep purple in the long Kansas dusk. He reached for her hand one evening and she gave it to him, and neither of them said anything about it. And after that it was simply what happened when they sat together, his hand around hers, the cold air moving around them and the warmth between them still. He kissed her in the kitchen on a Sunday morning when she was at the stove, and he came in from outside with cold air in his coat, and she turned to say something and he kissed her instead, tasting of cold and coffee, and she laughed against his mouth, and he held on and did not stop. He told her one night, sitting by the fire, that he had been afraid that what he felt for Clara was a kind of thing that only happened once, and that loving her again would feel like a betrayal of that, and that what he had found instead was that loving her, Eliza, this particular woman who had come to his door with her capable hands and her straight eyes and her stubborn willingness to wait him out, did not diminish anything that had come before but sat alongside it. In the way that different lights can occupy the same room without canceling each other. She took his hand when he said that. She said that she thought Clara would be glad that the farm was being cared for. He said he thought so too, and his voice was steady when he said it, and that steadiness told her that the grief was not gone. It would not simply be gone. That was not how grief worked, but that it had found its proper place in him, present but not primary, honored but no longer all-consuming. December passed. January was sharp and bright and very cold, and the south field lay under a covering of snow that made it look clean and full of potential, which Eliza thought every time she looked at it, and which she kept to herself, because she had learned that Harvey Garrett was the kind of man who arrived at things in his own time, and that arriving there on his own was important to him. He arrived there in February, on a Tuesday morning when the snow had broken for several days, and there was a quality to the light that suggested spring was thinking about it even if it had not committed yet. She was in the kitchen when she heard him come in from the barn, and then she heard him go out again, and when she looked out the window she saw him standing at the edge of the south field with his arms at his sides and his hat on his head, looking at it. He stood there for several minutes. She watched from the kitchen window, not moving, breathing quietly, giving him the space that the moment required. Then he turned and went to the barn, and when he came out he was pulling a piece of equipment, the hand plow, the one that stood against the barn wall and had not been moved in 2 years, and he walked to the edge of the south field, and he set the blade against the frozen crust of the earth, and he began. Eliza put on her coat and her boots and went out. She did not ask him anything. She went to the barn and found the other set of gloves on the nail where he kept them, and she came back and without a word she began working beside him, breaking the crust of the frozen soil, turning it, the effort warm and real in the cold morning air. He looked at her once sideways and she looked back, and that was all that was needed. They worked the south field that morning for 2 hours until they had turned a significant portion of it, and when they stopped and stood looking at the dark turned soil with their breath coming in clouds in the cold air, Harvey Garrett reached over and took her hand. "I am going to need help planting in the spring," he said. "I know," she said. "I will be here." He looked at her then, a full direct look, and said, "Eliza Fletcher, I would like you to be here in a more permanent arrangement than we currently have." She knew what he was asking. She looked at the turned soil and the farmhouse with the wide porch and the 2 chairs side by side, and she thought about empty chairs and full ones, about fields that go unplanted and fields that get planted again, about how the land remembers what was put into it even when you stop tending it, and how starting again is not the same as forgetting. It is the same as believing. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had been a long time coming, and was therefore larger inside than it appeared on the surface. And he raised her hand and pressed it against his mouth for a moment in the cold February air. They were married in March, in the parlor of the Methodist Church in Caldwell, which was a small building that smelled of wood oil and good intentions, and the ceremony was conducted by Reverend Clack, who was a lean, serious man who had the delivery of a person who believes in what he is saying, and therefore does not feel the need to embellish it. Mrs. Hollis was there, and Martha and Tom Holden, and several of their neighbors, and Sheriff Abernathy in his good coat, which he wore on occasions of consequence, and on no other occasions. Eliza wore a dress of blue-gray wool that she had made herself with fabric from Mrs. Hollis's store, and Harvey wore the dark coat he had worn to church on the Sundays when he went, which was not every Sunday but often enough that the coat was familiar to the congregation, and to Caldwell generally. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with an expression that was so unguarded and full that Mrs. Hollis, who was not sentimental by nature, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. They said the words to each other, with the kind of meaning that words have, when the people saying them have paid for them in the currency of real experience. When Harvey said, "Until death do us part," he said it knowing what that meant, knowing the weight of it, and his voice did not waver. Eliza heard the weight in it and held it with him. The spring came in earnest in April, and the south field got planted. Harvey plowed it properly with the full team and the big plow, and Eliza came behind with seed that she had selected with care over the winter. She had written to a seed supplier in St. Louis and had chosen varieties suited to the Kansas climate, and she had kept the order in the ledger under a column she had labeled Spring South Field, with the careful notation of someone who had been planning for this and was not going to leave it to chance. They planted it together, walking the rows in the spring morning, the earth soft and dark and giving under their feet, the air smelling of turned soil and possibility, and the particular cleanness of a Kansas spring that has come up from under the cold and is not apologizing for arriving. Harvey was deliberate and thorough as always, placing the seed with a care that she thought had in it something of ceremony, something of the morning he and Clara had done this first together, and she worked beside him, and the two things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other. When they were done, they stood at the edge of the field and looked at it, and Harvey put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and he said quietly, "That is done now." She understood what he meant, not only that the planting was done, but that something else had been finished and also begun, the way certain mornings are both those things at once. Summer of 1880 came to Caldwell with the kind of abundance that makes a person believe in things. The south field came up strong and green and thick in the July heat. The corn rose straight and tall as a conviction, and the kitchen garden was producing more than Eliza could put up, and Harvey's herd was healthy, and the railroad surveyors came back through and made their measurements again, and Bertram Foss reported from behind his bar that the depot was confirmed, coming through the following year. And the land on the south side of town would be worth considerably more than it had been. Harvey heard this and nodded and went home and built a new section of fence on the north pasture, because the fence needed it, and he had decided that the value of his land was not a reason to sell it, and not a reason to celebrate, but simply a fact about the world that he would note and continue working. Eliza told him in August, in the kitchen, after supper, that she was expecting. She told him matter-of-factly, sitting across from him at the table, because she was a matter-of-fact person, but her eyes were bright in a way that made matter-of-fact beside the point. Harvey looked at her and she watched the news arrive in him, watched it move across his face, and what she saw was not simply happiness but something that reached further back and further forward than happiness. A man receiving something he had learned not to hope for, and finding that he had been hoping for it all along, quietly, in the part of him that kept on living when the rest of him was learning how to manage. He got up from his chair and came around the table and put his arms around her and held on, and she rested her head against him and felt the steadiness of him that she had come to love the way you love something dependable, not with commotion but with a depth that has no bottom. "A boy, I hope," Harvey said into her hair, "though it does not matter." "It does not matter one bit," she agreed, though she privately thought a boy would be very fine. The boy was born in April of 1881, which was a good month for it, the plains warming up after the winter, the south field ready to be planted for the second season, the world opening up again. The birth was attended by Mrs. Hollis, who turned out to have considerable practical experience in such matters, and who managed the whole thing with the same efficient authority she applied to everything else. And by the end of a long April day, Harvey Garrett was sitting in the kitchen with his son in his arms, a large healthy boy with black hair who was regarding the world with the clear dark gaze of someone who has arrived somewhere important and is taking stock. Harvey named him James, after his own father. He held James against his chest in the kitchen while Eliza rested, and he sat in the quiet of the house with the child, his and Eliza's. And he thought about the farm and the south field and the chair on the porch, and all the seasons that had passed, and the one that was beginning. And he felt something that he did not have a name for, but that he recognized as the particular piece of a man who has been through the worst, and has found his way to something that can hold the weight of what he has been. Eliza was up within a week, which alarmed Harvey and impressed Mrs. Holly's, and within 2 weeks she was back in the kitchen and the garden and the ledger, with James in a cradle that Harvey had built during the winter from good oak, with joints so clean and tight that it was the kind of work that speaks for itself. She would sometimes put the cradle on the porch in the mild spring afternoons and sit beside it in one of the chairs, and Harvey would come from whatever he was doing and sit in the other chair, the two of them side by side in the porch chairs with their son between them in the cradle, and the south field green and coming up strong in the middle distance. The railroad came to Caldwell in 1881 as promised, and the depot was built on the south edge of town, and the town grew in the way towns grow when a railroad comes through, quickly and in layers, some of it good and some of it complicated and all of it requiring adjustment. There were more people, more commerce, more noise, and there were also more opportunities, and Harvey Garrett was a man who understood how to look at change and find the useful part of it. He expanded the farm's production over the next 2 years, adding acreage on the east side when the Morrow family sold their plot and moved to Colorado, and he built a second barn and hired two hands brothers named Pete and Daniel Rafferty from Missouri, who were honest workers and who regarded Eliza with the respectful wariness of men who have been told by their employer that the woman of the house is to be listened to on matters of business, and who have been told this in a tone that makes clear that it is not negotiable. Eliza took to the expansion of the business with the same methodical intelligence she had brought to the ledger on her first weeks at the farm, and the farm's books were kept with a precision that made Harvey's dealing with suppliers and buyers considerably more effective, because he always knew exactly where he stood, and so did they. The town of Caldwell knew them as a couple the way that small towns know their people intimately and sometimes incorrectly, but with a fundamental goodwill that expressed itself in the way people nodded at them in the street and inquired after James and sometimes after the farm, and in the way Mrs. Holly said to Eliza one afternoon in the store, with the same matter-of-fact brevity she applied to everything, "You did all right here." Eliza said, "I believe I did." James grew the way children grow on farms, which is fast and physical and with a complete lack of concern for how fast or physical he was being. By the time he was 2, he was following Harvey around the yard with the serious concentration of a person on an important errand, and Harvey took this following with a patience and attention that Eliza loved to watch. The way he would explain what he was doing as he did it, talking to James in the same even tone he used for everything, as though a 2-year-old's understanding of fence mending was a reasonable expectation, and James should simply know about it. James seemed to agree. He watched his father work with dark eyes that were entirely Harvey's and a focused expression that was beginning to look like Eliza's. In the spring of 1883, Eliza told Harvey at breakfast that there would be another child, and he set down his coffee cup and reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they looked at each other with the ease and depth of people who have been through enough together that the big moments and the ordinary moments have become the same substance. "James will want it to be a boy," Harvey said. "James wants everything to be exactly what it already is," Eliza said. "He will be fine." The second child was a girl, born in October of 1883, a girl with Eliza's coloring and Harvey's stubbornness, as they would discover within the first year of her life, and they named her Ruth, after Eliza's mother. Harvey held Ruth in the kitchen just as he had held James, with the same grave attention, and James stood next to him and looked at his sister with an expression of comprehensive skepticism that the adults found difficult not to laugh at. In the autumn of 1884, 5 years after Eliza had driven her wagon up the South Road and pulled to a stop in front of the farmhouse with its wide porch and its 2 chairs and its unplanted south field, Harvey came to her one afternoon while she was in the kitchen garden putting the beds to rest for the winter. She was on her knees in the soil, her gloves dark with earth, and he came around the side of the house and sat down on the low garden wall and watched her for a moment. "What are you thinking about?" she asked without looking up. "I am thinking that I would like to tell you something," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, pulling one glove off. He was wearing the look that she had come to know as his serious and not heavy look, the look he had when something was settled in him and he wanted to give it words. "I am listening," she said. "I am glad you came to this farm," he said. "I know I did not make it simple when you came. I know I told you I did not need help, and I know I pointed at an empty chair as my explanation for things. I was not in a condition to be grateful, but I am grateful." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that. I have been wanting to tell you that properly for a long time." She looked at him across the kitchen garden in the autumn afternoon, this man who had taught himself to keep going and had needed someone to remind him why. And she felt the love she had for him as a specific and particular thing. Not an abstraction, not an idea, but him, Harvey Garrett, with his deliberate hands and his quiet humor and his chair on the porch and his capacity for devotion that ran so deep it had simply continued even when he had tried to lay it down. Like a river that keeps moving even in drought. "Harvey," she said, "you are the reason I am grateful." He stood up from the garden wall and came to her and helped her up, and she left a smear of garden dirt on his coat that he did not mention, and she knew he would not mention. And he kissed her in the autumn garden the way he kissed her now, with the ease and sureness of a man who has come home to himself and knows it. That evening after supper, after James was in bed and Harvey had settled Ruth, who was not cooperative about sleeping and expressed this clearly, they sat on the porch in their 2 chairs in the cold October air with blankets across their laps, and the sky above the Kansas plains was full of stars in the way the sky over flat country is full of stars. Completely, without obstruction, all the way to the horizon in every direction, a canopy of light above the dark fields. The south field was plowed under for the season, lying quiet and fallow in the way that good soil lies fallow, resting and not vacant, gathering itself for the next season. Eliza looked at it in the starlight and thought about the first time she had seen it, the dry tangle of thistle and wild grass, the field that had been telling a story she had not yet known how to read. She had read it now. She had read it and understood it and had helped not by fixing it, but by staying, by showing up at the table and at the ledger and at the edge of the turned soil and saying here, "I am here," and meaning it. Harvey was looking at the stars and she was looking at the field, and then he reached over without looking at her and took her hand. And she turned her hand in his so their fingers laced together. And they sat there on the porch in the quiet of the October night while the stars moved slowly overhead, and the farm rested around them, alive and held and whole. There was one thing more, and it happened the following spring, in May of 1885, when the south field was green again, and the railroad had brought enough commerce to Caldwell that the town had 2 churches and a school and a newspaper, and James was old enough to follow his father into the field with a purpose that was beginning to be useful rather than merely devoted. Harvey had given James the job of walking the rows in the morning and reporting on what he found, and James took this responsibility with a gravity that made Eliza love him in a way that was almost funny in its intensity. This 4-year-old boy walking the corn rows in his boots with his hands clasped behind his back like a small magistrate conducting an inspection. One evening in May, Harvey came home from town with a piece of news delivered by a stranger passing through from the south, that a man named Eliza Fletcher had appeared in a town called Dodge City, asking after a woman named Eliza Fletcher who had once lived in Abilene. Harvey told her this carefully, watching her face, because the name Fletcher was hers and he wanted to know what it meant to her. She said she had an uncle on her father's side, a man she had not seen in 15 years. Her father and his brother had fallen out over a piece of land, as brothers sometimes do, and the silence between them had calcified over the years into the kind of estrangement that everyone involved stops believing could ever be undone. She said she had not thought of him in years. Harvey said it was her decision what to do, and that was all he said, which she appreciated. She wrote a letter to Dodge City addressed to Eliza Fletcher, and she sent it with the next mail rider going south. 3 weeks later, a letter came back in handwriting that looked like her father's handwriting in the way that a brother's handwriting looks like its sibling. The same bones, differently expressed. And in the letter, her uncle said that he had heard of her father's death, that he was sorry, that he had been trying to find her for 2 years, and that he was too old to be proud about old grievances, and would she be willing to correspond. She wrote back and said yes. Harvey read her reply before she sealed it, because she showed it to him, and he read it carefully and handed it back and said it was a good letter, and she sealed it and sent it. And over the following months the correspondence continued and the estrangement began, slowly and not without friction, to become something else. By Christmas of 1885, her uncle had been invited to Caldwell for the new year, and had come, an old man with white hair and her father's eyes, who sat at their kitchen table and ate Eliza's cooking and talked with Harvey about farming with the seriousness of a man who had grown up working land and had kept a respect for it, and who looked at Eliza across the table with an expression that said he was sorry in ways that the words available to him were not quite adequate to convey. She had forgiven him before he came. She had made that decision privately, not dramatically, because forgiveness is a choice that a person makes for their own reasons and in their own time, and not always at the moment that anyone else would choose. She told him this on the second day of his visit while they were sitting on the porch, the three of them. Eliza and her uncle and Harvey, and her uncle pressed his lips together and looked away toward the south field for a moment, and then looked back at her and nodded once. James appeared at the porch railing with a frog he had found, and immediately the conversation changed entirely, because a 4-year-old with a frog is not something that can be politely ignored, and the old man looked at the boy with the frog and laughed with a suddenness that surprised him and delighted James, and something settled into place between the generations that could not have been arranged but simply happened. Eliza Fletcher returned to Dodge City with the promise to come back in the summer, and he kept that promise, and the summer visits became the thing they became, which was a fixture of the life on the farm and a gift that Eliza had not known to expect. The years passed in the way good years pass, not quickly, not slowly, but with the full weight and texture of years that are being lived rather than survived. James grew into a boy who was built for the farm, strong and capable with his father's hands and the stubborn intelligence he had from both of them, who could be found at 12 years old helping Harvey with the heavier work, and who had already decided that this was his place and his work, and was not apologetic about knowing it so early. Ruth grew into a girl who was built for something the farm could not entirely contain. She was bright and restless and curious about everything, and had opinions about everything she was curious about. And Harvey and Eliza discussed her future the way you discuss the future of someone you are trying to see clearly, without the overlay of what you want for them. And they agreed that she would need more school than Caldwell could offer her, and that they would find a way to provide it. In 1890, the year James turned 9, Eliza was pregnant again, and this third child was born in the winter, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived on a February morning while the south field lay under snow for the 9th time since Eliza had come to the farm and turned it and planted it and made it again into a living thing. Harvey held Thomas in the kitchen, a big quiet baby with Eliza's coloring and Harvey's calm, and James sat at the table looking at his new brother with a new kind of gravity, not the skepticism he had shown at Ruth's arrival, but something older and more knowing, as though becoming a brother twice had taught him something about what the word meant and what it asked of a person. "He is very small," James said. "You were very small," Harvey said. "I do not remember that." "No," Harvey said. "You would not." Outside, the snow fell on the south field, clean and covering, and Eliza watched from her bed in the room off the kitchen, the same room where she had slept on her first night at the farm, all those years ago, before the room off the kitchen had become a different place entirely. And she listened to Harvey and James in the kitchen with the baby, and she thought about the south road and the empty field and the 2 chairs, and the way a life accumulates itself around a person, quietly and with intention. like good soil building up over seasons. She was 39 years old, and she had been on this farm for 11 years, and the south field had been planted every spring for 9 of those 11 years. And the 2 chairs on the porch had been sat in every evening for 9 of those years. And the ledger in the sitting room was current and accurate, and reflected a farm that was not only surviving, but producing something that a person could be proud of. And the family that occupied the house had expanded in all the good ways. A family expands outward and deeper, with more voices and more feet on the floor and more need for the kitchen table to accommodate everyone, which Harvey had solved the previous year by building a longer table. From timber he had cut himself. In the spring of 1891, when the south field was being planted for the 10th season, a fact that Eliza noted in the ledger with a small private satisfaction. She and Harvey sat on the porch one evening in the early May warmth, and James was doing something at the edge of the yard with a contraption he had built from sticks and wire for a purpose that had not been fully explained, and Ruth was reading inside by the lamp, and Thomas was asleep in his cradle in the kitchen. And the field was green in the long light, and Eliza turned to Harvey and looked at him with the directness that had always been one of the first things he had noticed, and one of the last things he would ever stop noticing. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her. Then he looked at the field, green and standing, turning toward the evening light. He looked at James at the edge of the yard. He looked at the house behind them, warm and lit. "Yes," he said, "more than I have the right to say." "You have every right," she said. He took her hand. They sat in their chairs on the porch of the farmhouse on the South Road in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1891, and the field was full of growing things, and the house was full of living people, and the sky above the plains was the color of a promise being kept, and that was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. The seasons after that continued to come and go as seasons do, each one distinct from the last, each one building on what the previous ones had laid down. The Garrett farm became known in the county as one of the most well-run operations along the South Road, not the largest and not the richest, but consistent and careful and managed by people who understood the relationship between what you put into land and what the land gave back. Buyers from the railroad depot in town became regular purchasers of the farm's output, and Harvey negotiated these arrangements with the quiet competence of a man who had learned the worth of what he had, and was not inclined to accept less than it. The town of Caldwell grew around them, as towns do when a railroad comes through: more stores, more families, more noise and energy, and the particular busyness of a place that has decided it is going somewhere. The school expanded, which mattered to Eliza, who had spent 3 years on the school board by 1893, and who had opinions about the quality of instruction that she expressed with the same patient precision she brought to the farm ledger. The Methodist Church got a new roof with the help of a collection that Harvey contributed to substantially, because it was the church where they had been married, and he considered that a reason to maintain it. Martha and Tom Holden remained close to them through all of it, Martha still small and brisk and copper-haired, though with more gray in it now, coming to supper on the farm several times each season, and sitting at Harvey's long table with the easy comfort of people who know they are always welcome. Tom Holden said little as ever but ate well, and was fond of James in the straightforward way of a man who approves of a boy who knows how to work, which James emphatically did. Ruth left for school in Topeka in 1896, when she was 12, boarding with a family that Martha knew. This was Martha's doing, a careful arrangement that gave Ruth access to a school that could actually meet her where she was. And Eliza wrote her long letters every week, and Ruth wrote back in a handwriting that was sharper and more assured than her mother's, and contained an account of the world as Ruth encountered it that made Eliza and Harvey read the letters at the kitchen table, and occasionally read passages aloud to each other with expressions of mingled pride and amusement. James, meanwhile, was exactly where he had always been, which was on the farm and intending to stay there. And at 16, he was doing a man's share of the work and managing it with a steadiness that reminded Eliza of Harvey at his best, methodical and thorough, and not inclined to complain. Thomas at 6 was following James the way James had once followed Harvey, and the circle of it, the following, the watching, the learning, was something Eliza thought about on the porch in the evenings with the kind of gratitude that has no particular object but fills up all the available space. Harvey was 47 in 1898, and Eliza was 45, and the south field had been planted every spring for 17 consecutive seasons, and there were mornings when Harvey stood at the edge of it, the way he had stood at the edge of it on that February morning, when she had watched from the kitchen window and known, in the way you know things when you have been paying attention for long enough, that something was returning to him. He did not stand at the edge of it any more with that particular weight. He stood at the edge of it the way a person stands at the edge of something that belongs to them, surveying it, accounting for it, making plans. She came to stand beside him one such morning in the spring of 1898, the ground soft under their feet, the field just beginning to show the green push of the season's planting. She stood next to him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there together looking at the field that had been left to ruin and had been brought back and had been planted every year since and would be planted next year and the year after and as many years as they had left in them to do it. "It is a good field," he said. "It always was," she said. "It just needed tending." He looked at her, then with a look that she knew had always meant more than any particular thing. He was looking at a look that had started across a barn in December and had grown over 19 years into something that was simply the way he looked at her, as though she was the thing that made the view make sense. "So did I," he said. She leaned into him. The sun was coming up over the flat Kansas horizon, and the field was green, and the house was behind them with the smoke of the breakfast fire beginning to rise from the chimney, and somewhere inside Thomas was already awake and making the sounds of a 7-year-old who has decided the day should be starting. And James was at the barn, and Ruth was in Topeka writing a letter that would arrive on Thursday, and the 2 chairs on the porch were waiting for the evening. It was a life that had been planted in grief and grown in love, and was tended daily by 2 people who understood that the tending was not a burden but the point, that you did not get the harvest without the seasons of hard work, and the trust that what you put into the ground would come back to you changed and multiplied, and more than what you started with. On a warm September evening in 1899, as the 20th century pressed toward its beginning, and the south field was golden with the last of the season, and ready to be turned for winter, Eliza Fletcher Garrett sat in her chair on the porch of her farmhouse with her husband in the chair beside her and her son Thomas at her feet, working on something with a piece of string that he had been working on for 3 days, and James was coming across the yard from the barn with his slow, easy walk. And a letter from Ruth was on the table inside saying that she was well, and that she had news she would tell them when she came for Christmas, and the sky above the Kansas plains was doing everything it knew how to do with a September sunset, all that gold and orange and pink spread out to the horizon, and Eliza looked at all of it and felt the full weight of how much had been given to her, not easily, not without cost, but given, truly given in the way that the best things are given, by working for them, by staying when staying was hard, by choosing, morning after morning, to be present to the life that was in front of her. Harvey turned to look at her as though he had felt her thinking, which perhaps he had, and he reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand, and their fingers laced together the way they had laced together on every evening of the years they had been in these chairs, side by side, no longer one of them empty. "Good evening," he said, as though she had just arrived. She smiled at him. "Good evening, Mr. Garrett." He smiled back. The sun went down over the Kansas plains, and the south field held its quiet at the end of another good season, and the farmhouse held its warmth and its people, and the chairs on the porch held the 2 of them, and there was nothing left undone that mattered, and everything that mattered had been done.